She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not fall apart on the doorstep of the house she had helped build, the house where she had painted the nursery walls by hand, the house where she had made Valentine's Day dinner that same evening, still believing, still trying, still hoping. She just stood there. February cold, 10 days after a cesarean section, a newborn strapped to her chest, and the door of her own home closing in her face while the woman her husband had brought to replace her rearranged the cushions inside. Most people in that moment would have broken. Sophia Calloway did not break. She made a phone call. And what happened next, over the following 12 months, would cost her husband everything he thought he had secured, expose a financial crime he believed was invisible, and return to Sophia not just a house, not just a settlement, but something he never anticipated she would rebuild. Herself. Stay with this story, because the moment you think you know how it ends, it goes somewhere you did not see coming, and the twist that changes everything is not the one anyone expected. Lesson line. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is not fight louder. It is document quietly, trust the right people, and refuse, even in the cold, even alone, to stop believing they are worth fighting for. Meaning plus value to the audience. This story is not just about one woman and one marriage and one terrible February night. It is about every person who has ever signed something they trusted without reading it. Every person who gave up something, a career, an independence, a version of themselves because someone they loved made it sound like generosity. Every person who has stood at a point of complete devastation and had to decide, in that exact moment, whether to collapse or continue. What Sophia's story gives you is not a legal manual. It is a map of what is possible when you choose, even once, even barely, to make the call to action. If this story moved you, if even one moment of it felt familiar, or gave you something you needed to hear today, do something small that costs you nothing and means more than you know. Leave a comment. It does not have to be long. Even one word tells us this story reached someone. Share it with one person. You may not know why they need it. Share it anyway. And if you want more stories like this one, stories that are honest about the hard things and real about what comes after, subscribe to this channel. We will be here.
The thing about a beautiful life is that it can look completely intact from the outside, even while it is quietly falling apart from within. Sophia Calloway had spent 4 years building something she believed in with every careful, hopeful part of herself. A home, a marriage, a future that felt solid enough to stand on. And for a long time, at least from where she was standing, it seemed like it was working. The house on Maple Ridge sat at the end of a quiet street in suburban Connecticut, where the trees turned gold every October and the neighbors still waved from their driveways. It was a colonial-style home with white shutters and a front porch that Sophia had strung with small lights the first winter they moved in. Marcus had laughed when he saw her doing it, standing on a stepladder in her coat, untangling strings of bulbs with focused determination. "You're going to fall," he had said. "I'm not going to fall," she had replied. "Hand me the extension cord." He had handed it to her, and she had finished the lights, and that night they sat on the porch with 2 mugs of hot chocolate and looked at what they had made together. Sophia had thought, sitting there in the cold with her husband beside her, and the whole quiet neighborhood stretched out in front of them, that this was exactly what she had wanted. This precise, ordinary, luminous moment. She was 32 years old. She had given up her career as a middle school art teacher at Marcus's suggestion, somewhere in the second year of their marriage, so she could focus on building their home and eventually their family. "You won't regret it," he had told her. "I make enough for both of us. You've been working since you were 16. Let yourself rest." It had sounded, at the time, like generosity. Looking back, with the clarity that only comes after everything has been stripped away, she would understand it differently. It was not generosity. It was the first break removed from her foundation. Marcus Calloway was 36, a regional sales director at a pharmaceutical company called Meridian Health Solutions. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's name at a party and forgot his wife's coffee order at home. Confident, charming in the specific way that works best at a distance. He had a strong handshake and a good smile and a habit of making every room feel like it was slightly waiting for him to arrive. Sophia had fallen for all of it completely and without reservation, the way you do when you are 28 and optimistic and have not yet learned that charm and character are entirely different things. By the time Sophia was 8 months pregnant, she had begun to notice the cracks she had been spackling over for longer than she cared to admit. The late evenings that stretched past 10 without a text, the phone turned face down on the dinner table, the cologne that did not match the bottle in the bathroom cabinet, small things, individually dismissible. But patterns do not lie, even when the people creating them do. She told herself to wait, get through the birth. Everything else can wait. On November 3rd, baby Emma Rose Calloway arrived at 6:47 in the morning, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with her mother's eyes and her father's chin, which Sophia would later decide was the only thing Emma needed from Marcus. The labor had been long and the delivery had required a cesarean section, which meant Sophia was recovering from major surgery while also learning to nurse a newborn, while also managing the particular exhaustion that sits behind your eyes for the first weeks of a baby's life and does not fully lift for months. Marcus was present at the hospital. He held Emma once, briefly, with the careful stiffness of a man handling something he did not fully trust himself with. When his phone buzzed during that first hour, he glanced at the screen. Sophia saw him look. She did not say anything, but she noticed. She was always noticing, even when she pretended not to. In the 2 weeks that followed, Marcus became a ghost in his own house. Late returns, absent weekends, client dinners that ran past midnight. Sophia, still moving carefully, due to her surgical recovery, handled the 3 a.m. feedings alone and the diaper changes alone and the particular loneliness of sitting in a dark nursery at 4 in the morning with a sleeping baby on your chest and an empty space in the bed down the hall that was supposed to have someone in it. One night, when Emma was 11 days old and Marcus had not come home by 2 in the morning, Sophia picked up her phone and opened the location-sharing app they had set up together 2 years earlier, originally as a safety feature. The little blue dot that represented her husband was sitting at an address 12 minutes from their house. She typed the address into a search. It came back as a restaurant called the Barlow. A nice one, the kind with a wine list and low lighting. She sat with that information for a long time. The house was quiet around her. Emma breathed softly against her shoulder. Sophia put the phone down and said, very quietly into the darkness, "Okay. Okay then." She did not cry. She was not ready to cry yet. She was still gathering herself, the way you do before something large and irreversible begins. She held her daughter a little closer, and she rocked in the chair, and she let the night pass. 3 days later, it was February 14th, Valentine's Day. Sophia had made dinner despite barely being able to stand for more than 20 minutes at a stretch. Nothing extravagant. Pasta, a salad, candles on the table. A genuine effort from a woman who was still hoping, against the growing weight of evidence, that there was something left worth saving. Marcus came home at 9 in the evening. He was not alone. The woman behind him was named Clare Weston. She was 29, wearing a camel coat and heels that clicked on the hardwood, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who has been told she is winning. She looked at Sophia with an expression that was carefully neutral and did not quite succeed. Marcus did not meet Sophia's eyes. "We need to talk," he said. Sophia stood very still in her own kitchen, in the house she had decorated and cleaned and filled with the small accumulated evidence of a life she had tried to build, holding a dish towel and looking at her husband and the woman he had brought into her home on Valentine's Day, 10 days after she had delivered his daughter via emergency cesarean section. She said, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, "You brought her here, into our home, tonight." Marcus said, "The marriage has been over for a long time, Sophia." And Claire said, with the small smile of someone who believes they have already won, "I told him this was a bad idea, but he insisted on being honest." Sophia looked at the word honest for a moment like it was an object she had picked up and found to be hollow. Then she said very quietly, "Get out of my kitchen." She picked up her phone and she walked upstairs. Marcus called after her. She did not turn around. She sat on the edge of the bed in the room she had shared with him for 4 years, and she looked at her hands, and she understood, with a completeness that settled over her like cold water, that everything she had believed about her life was about to change. Downstairs, she could hear Claire's heels on the hardwood. Sophia took a breath. Then she made a phone call. 30 minutes after Sophia walked upstairs, Marcus followed her. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom, with his hands in his pockets and the particular expression of a man who has made a decision and is now waiting for the paperwork to clear. "I need you to leave tonight," he said. Sophia was sitting on the bed. She had not moved much. She had been thinking, which is sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do when someone is counting on them to react emotionally. "This is my home," she said. "My name is on the mortgage." Marcus reached into his jacket and produced a folded set of documents. He set them on the dresser with the practiced calm of someone who has rehearsed this moment. "Actually," he said, "I refinanced last year. You signed the paperwork with the tax documents. Do you remember the stack I gave you in March? The property is currently in my name alone." The room went very quiet. Sophia looked at the documents without touching them. She had signed things in March. A stack of papers Marcus had set in front of her, while she was 7 months pregnant and exhausted from a difficult second trimester and still trusting, the man she had married. "You had me sign away my name on our house," she said. It was not quite a question. "I'm not trying to be cruel," Marcus said, which is something people say when they are being cruel and have decided to reframe it. "I'll cover a hotel for 2 weeks while you find somewhere. Claire will help with the transition." From downstairs, they could hear Claire moving through the living room, the sound of cushions being rearranged. Sophia stood up. She moved to the closet and began pulling out a bag. Baby items first. Diapers, wipes, 2 onesies. Emma's small fleece blanket with the yellow ducks on it. Then her own pain medication from the nightstand. The prescription from her OB for post-surgical recovery. Her phone charger. Her wallet. She worked with a mechanical focus, the kind your body produces when your mind has temporarily separated itself from the situation in order to survive it. She did not allow herself to look at the framed photo on the dresser, the one from their wedding, where Marcus was laughing at something she had said, and she was looking at him with an expression of pure, uncomplicated happiness. She could not afford to look at that right now. When she was done, she carried the bag and walked downstairs. Emma was still asleep in the bassinet in the corner of the living room, unaware, breathing the small, steady breaths of a baby who does not yet know what the world is capable of. Clare was on the couch. She looked up when Sophia entered. Neither woman said anything. Sophia lifted Emma from the bassinet with the careful, practiced movement of someone who had spent 10 days learning the exact way to hold this particular small person. She strapped Emma into the carrier against her chest, feeling the familiar weight of her daughter settle against her heartbeat. Emma stirred briefly, then went still. Marcus stood by the front door. He opened it. The February air moved into the house immediately, cold and direct. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said, which was either a promise or a dismissal, and was probably both. Sophia looked at him for one long moment. She looked at Clare. She looked at the candles she had lit for dinner, still burning on the table, the pasta going cold in the pot, the salad she had made, because she had still believed that very morning that there was something worth trying to save. Then she said, quietly, but with an edge that would stay with Marcus longer than he expected, "You better hope I'm in too much pain to think clearly tonight, because tomorrow I'm going to remember everything." She walked out into the February cold. The door closed behind her. She heard the lock engage. She stood on the porch for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to let the cold hit her face, and for something in her chest to harden into something useful. Then she walked to her car, strapped Emma into the car seat with hands that did not shake, and started the engine. She called her sister. Dana Hartley was 38, a kindergarten teacher who lived 20 minutes away in a smaller house that was nevertheless warmer in every sense than the colonial on Maple Ridge had felt for months. When Sophia called, Dana answered on the second ring, despite the hour, and when Sophia said, "He brought her to the house. He signed me off the mortgage. He wants me out tonight," Dana said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Drive to me right now. Drive carefully. I'm turning on the porch light." Sophia drove. Emma slept in the back seat, still unaware, still breathing those small, reassuring breaths. The streets were empty at 10 in the evening. Connecticut, in February, has a particular quality of cold silence that feels like the whole world has decided to wait and see what happens next. Dana was at the door before Sophia had finished parking. She came down the front steps in socked feet and a coat thrown over her pajamas, and she pulled Sophia inside without ceremony, taking the baby bag first and then reaching back to take Sophia's arm, guiding her into the warmth. They sat in the kitchen. Dana made tea without asking. Sophia told her everything in flat, sequential order, the way you give a report when the alternative is falling apart, and falling apart is not currently an option. When Sophia finished, Dana set down her mug. "He refinanced without telling you," she said. "I signed what he put in front of me," Sophia said. "I trusted him." Dana looked at her sister for a moment with an expression that contained in order grief and fury, and then a very specific kind of resolve. "My college roommate is a family law attorney," she said, pulling out her phone. "Her name is Rebecca Cole. I'm calling her right now." "Dana, it's 10 o'clock at night." "Rebecca will answer," Dana said. "She hates men like Marcus." Sophia looked at her daughter, asleep in the carrier, on the kitchen chair beside her, one small fist curled against her cheek, the yellow duck blanket tucked around her legs. "She sounds like my kind of person," Sophia said. It was the first thing close to a smile she had managed all night. Small, brief, and real. Dana was already dialing. Outside, the February wind pressed against the windows. Inside, the kettle was still warm, and the porch light was on, and Sophia Calloway sat in her sister's kitchen and began very quietly and very deliberately to fight back. The first call is always the one that changes everything, Sophia had just made it. Rebecca Cole arrived the next morning at 7:30, still in her running clothes, carrying a tote bag of legal pads and the energy of someone who had already been awake for 2 hours and had opinions about it. She was 40 years old, with sharp eyes and a dry sense of humor and the particular manner of a person who has spent 15 years watching people underestimate her and has learned to find it useful. She looked at the documents Marcus had left on Sophia's behalf, the refinancing papers, the original mortgage, and the handful of tax documents Sophia had been able to pull from her phone's photo storage, for about 4 minutes without speaking. Donna poured coffee. Emma slept in the bassinet they had set up in the corner. Finally, Rebecca looked up. "Okay," she said. "The refinancing is a serious problem, but not necessarily a permanent one. Tell me exactly how it was presented to you." Sophia walked her through it. The stack of documents in March. The pen already in her hand. Marcus explaining it was routine tax paperwork, a refinance to get a better rate, nothing she needed to read carefully. Rebecca wrote something down. "Did he sit with you while you signed, or did he leave the papers and come back?" "He sat there. He turned the pages." "Did you read any of them?" "I read the first 2 pages. Then he said he was running late for a call and I should just finish signing." Rebecca wrote something else down. Then she said, "Connecticut is an equitable distribution state. The property may currently be in his name, but if marital funds contributed to the mortgage payments, the down payment, the improvements, you have a claim to equitable share regardless of whose name is on the deed." She paused. "How long were you contributing financially before you stopped working?" "I taught for 3 years after we married. I put every paycheck into our joint account. The down payment on the house came from that account." "And the decision to stop working, whose idea was it?" "His. He said he made enough. He said I should rest." Sophia heard how it sounded now, hearing it said out loud in someone else's kitchen. He said it was generous. Rebecca nodded slowly. "I want to be very clear with you about something, and I need you to hear it as a fact and not as a judgment. What you just described, controlling finances, managing what you signed, directing your career decisions, these are patterns that courts increasingly recognize as economic control within a marriage. You didn't miss something. You were managed. There's a difference." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. This is the first thing every person in Sophia's position needs to understand. When someone controls the financial information in a relationship, when they decide what gets signed and what gets explained and what gets quietly rerouted, the other person is not being foolish. They are being deliberately kept in the dark. The blame belongs entirely to the one holding the flashlight and choosing to point it away. Dana set a coffee mug in front of Sophia. Rebecca continued. "The night he sent you out, Valentine's Day, was anyone around, neighbors? Any cameras on the street?" Sophia thought about it. "The Hendersons across the street have a Ring camera on their porch. It faces the street. Our driveway would be in frame." Rebecca smiled for the first time. It was a small, precise smile. "I love neighbors with porch cameras." She made a note. "One more thing. His social media. Is he active?" Dana reached across the table and pulled up her phone screen. She had already screenshotted it the night before. The post Marcus had put up on his personal account. A photo of himself and Clare at a restaurant table, a bottle of wine, the candles in the background. Posted at 11:47 in the evening. Caption reading, "New chapter," with a champagne glass. The timestamp was 32 minutes after Sophia had left the house. Rebecca looked at it for a long moment. "He posted a celebration photo," she said. 32 minutes after sending his post-surgical wife and 10-day-old daughter outside in February. "Yes," Dana said. "And he works in pharmaceuticals," Rebecca said. A regulated industry. Yes. Rebecca closed her legal pad. I'm going to need a retainer in about 6 weeks, and I want you both to understand something clearly. We are not in a weak position here. He thinks we are, because he controlled the information, which means he controlled what he thought Sophia knew. But controlling information is not the same as controlling the facts. The facts are still out there. We're going to find them. She stood up, tote bag over her shoulder, and looked at Sophia directly. Do not contact Marcus. Do not post anything. Do not respond to anything he sends you without running it past me first. One message at a time, one document at a time, we are going to build something he will not be able to argue his way out of. Sophia nodded. And one more thing, Rebecca said, already moving toward the door. Take photos of everything you can still access. Bank statements on your phone app, text messages, any financial documents he ever sent you digitally. Do it today before he realizes you're no longer standing still. She left. The front door closed behind her. Dana and Sophia sat in the sudden quiet. She's terrifying, Dana said. She's exactly what I needed, Sophia replied. She picked up her phone and started taking screenshots. While Sophia was documenting everything with the focused efficiency of someone who had just been given a reason to pay attention, Marcus was standing in the kitchen of the house on Maple Ridge, making the first of several catastrophic errors in judgment. He was feeling, it must be said, extremely confident. This was a problem. Marcus Calloway had spent several months planning what he thought of privately as his transition. He had believed, based on a careful assessment of Sophia's situation, that she would be too overwhelmed, too financially dependent, and too emotionally exhausted from new motherhood to mount any real resistance. She had no income. She was recovering from surgery. She had, as far as he could tell, nothing but her sister and a baby and whatever remained of her pride. What he had failed to account for was that pride, in the right person, is not a vulnerability. It is a fuel source. He was also not aware, at this point, that Rebecca Cole existed. Claire was at the kitchen table with her laptop, looking at interior design websites with the particular focus of a woman who has been waiting for permission to redecorate. She had moved into the house 3 days after Valentine's Day, with the efficiency of someone who had already mentally moved in weeks earlier. "What are you worried about?" she asked, when Marcus stood at the counter staring at his phone. "She transferred money," he said. Claire looked up. "From the joint account," Marcus said. "She moved her half this morning." "Her half," Claire repeated. "She thinks she has a half?" "The original contribution structure was equal," Marcus said, which was the first honest thing he had said in several months. "For the joint account, technically, yes." "She moved fast," Claire said. "She had help," Marcus said. He was beginning to feel, in a region just behind his sternum, the first small, cold tremor of someone who has miscalculated. He pushed it away. "It doesn't matter. The house is in my name. The car is in my name. She can move whatever she wants from the joint account. That's already factored in. What she can't do is touch the property." What he did not know, and would not know for several more weeks, was that Rebecca had also contacted the Hendersons across the street, who had, as it turned out, excellent camera footage. He did not know that the pharmacy benefit records from his company showed a pattern of expenses that would become relevant shortly. He did not know that Dana had screenshotted his 11:47 celebration post before he had thought to delete it. And he absolutely did not know about Paul Merritt. He also, crucially, did not know what Sophia was doing with her phone. At the pharmaceutical company where Marcus worked, there was an HR handbook that included clear guidelines about conduct and public behavior. Marcus had never read it closely. This would also become relevant. In the meantime, he made his second mistake. He called Sophia. She did not answer, which surprised him. She had always answered before. He left a voicemail that was meant to sound reasonable and landed somewhere between patronizing and threatening, explaining that she should think carefully about how she wanted to proceed, that he was willing to be civil, that making things difficult would only hurt Emma in the long run. He used Emma's name as leverage in a voicemail. This was recorded. Rebecca would later describe it in court documents as, quote, a baseline illustration of the respondent's approach to co-parenting. The third mistake came that same week, when Marcus ran into a mutual friend named Greg at a gas station and, feeling expansive and confident, gave Greg an edited version of events in which Sophia had been struggling with her mental health since the birth, had become increasingly erratic, and he had made the difficult decision to prioritize everyone's safety and well-being. Greg, who was not a particularly subtle person, mentioned this to his wife. His wife mentioned it to 3 people at the school pickup line. By Thursday of that week, Sophia's neighbor Heather was looking at her with a particular kind of careful pity that meant the story had gotten there first. Marcus believed this was working in his favor. He did not understand that every person who heard his version and later learned the truth would become a data point in a larger picture. He was building a narrative, but he was building it on ground that was about to shift. Meanwhile, Rebecca filed the first set of emergency motions. Temporary child support, pending full proceedings. Temporary use of the marital vehicle, given that Sophia was the primary caregiver of a newborn. Documentation request for all financial accounts associated with the marriage. The documentation request was the one that would matter most. Because Rebecca had a suspicion, based on 17 years of family law practice and a particular pattern she had noticed in the bank statements Sophia had photographed, that there was more money than Marcus was letting anyone see. She brought in Paul Merritt. Paul Merritt was a forensic accountant who worked out of a small office in Hartford and spoke almost entirely in facts. He was quiet, meticulous, and extraordinarily good at finding things that had been arranged to be invisible. Rebecca trusted him completely and deployed him precisely. When she told Sophia she was bringing Paul in, Sophia asked what he would be looking for. Rebecca said, I don't know yet, but I know there's something to find. People who plan an exit the way Marcus planned, his don't usually leave everything in plain sight. She was right. It would take Paul 3 weeks to complete his initial review. The results, when they came, would change everything about the shape of this case. But that was still ahead. For now, Sophia was at Dana's house, recovering from surgery and learning to nurse and waking at 3 in the morning with Emma and sitting in the small guest room with its floral wallpaper and its one window overlooking the backyard and its complete, uncomplicated safety. She was not sleeping well. She was not eating as much as she should. She was tired in a way that lived in her bones, but she was thinking clearly. And that, as it turned out, was exactly what was needed. 6 weeks after Valentine's Day, something happened that Sophia had not allowed herself to expect. She won. The emergency custody motion, filed by Rebecca with careful precision and supported by the ring camera footage from the Henderson house, the medical records from Sophia's OB documenting her post-surgical status on the night she was sent out, the pediatric records showing Emma's continuous care under Sophia's supervision, and the 1147 social media post that Marcus had deleted, but which existed in 4 separate screenshot archives, came before a family court judge named the Honorable Patricia Warren. Judge Warren was 61 years old and had been presiding over family court for 22 years. She had seen most things. She reviewed the preliminary evidence with the expression of someone who had made up her mind within the first 10 minutes, but intended to honor the full process regardless. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Garrett Price, the attorney Marcus had hired, was expensive and loud and deployed a strategy of suggesting that Sophia's postpartum recovery was evidence of instability rather than evidence of having recently had major surgery, which is what it actually was. Rebecca dismantled this approach with the particular efficiency of someone who had anticipated it completely. When the ruling came, it was clear. Primary custody remained with Sophia, pending full proceedings. Marcus was granted supervised visitation every other Saturday to be conducted at a designated family services location. Temporary child support was ordered at an amount that reflected Marcus's documented income. The marital vehicle was formally assigned to Sophia's use. Outside the courthouse on a gray March afternoon, Dana cried. Rebecca was professionally composed, but her eyes were bright. Sophia held Emma against her chest and read the order twice. "Is it over?" she asked. "The custody round is over," Rebecca said. "You won this one cleanly," Sophia breathed out. Something that had been wound tight in her chest for 6 weeks released a fraction of an inch. She allowed herself, for the first time since February 14th, to feel something close to hope. This was understandable. It was also premature. 11 days later, Sophia drove to her parents' house in western Massachusetts for a weekend visit. Her mother had not met Emma yet. The drive was 2 hours. She texted Marcus on Friday afternoon to let him know she would be out of the county for the weekend and would return Sunday evening. She did not file a written notice with the court. She did not know she was required to. The temporary custody order included a provision requiring formal written notification through proper legal channels for any travel outside the county, and Rebecca had explained this provision during their initial review of the order, but had not, in the press of preparing for the custody hearing, been explicit enough about the mechanics of compliance. Sophia came home Sunday evening feeling better than she had in months. Her mother had held Emma for 3 hours and cried quietly into her granddaughter's hair. Her father had grilled chicken in February because Sophia mentioned she was craving it. Standing at the backyard grill in his winter coat with a spatula and a determination that made her heart ache with love for him. She had slept 8 hours in her childhood bedroom with Emma in a portable crib beside her and woken up feeling, for one brief and genuine morning, like herself. Then Rebecca called Monday at 9. "Sophia, sit down." The 3 words that mean nothing good. Sophia sat down at Dana's kitchen table. Emma was in the bouncy seat, kicking her feet at the mobile above her with the focused intensity of a person who has discovered cause and effect and finds it fascinating, Rebecca explained. Marcus's attorney had filed a motion to review the custody order based on a violation of the travel notification provision, the Massachusetts trip, the text message, the absence of a formal filing. "Can he take her because of this?" Sophia asked. "Not permanently," Rebecca said. "But it gives Garrett Price a foothold. It makes us look careless in front of a judge who values procedural compliance. And Judge Warren does value procedural compliance. I didn't know I needed to file formally. I texted him. I know, and I should have been more explicit when we reviewed the order. This is on both of us." Rebecca's voice was steady, but there was something careful in it. "Here's what I need you to understand. This does not undo what we built. It is a setback, not a collapse. We respond, we demonstrate good faith compliance going forward, and we let Paul Merritt's findings shift the center of gravity in this case." "What has Paul found?" Sophia asked. A pause. "I want to go over it with you in person," Rebecca said. "Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" Sophia looked at Emma, still kicking at the mobile, still completely unbothered by the world and its complications. "Yes," she said. "I'll be there." She spent the rest of the day quiet. Dana made dinner and did not ask too many questions, which was one of the things Sophia loved most about her sister. Dana understood the difference between presence and pressure. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sophia sat in the dark guest room and thought about what Rebecca had said. A setback, not a collapse. She repeated it to herself until it felt true enough to sleep on. She had made a mistake. She could not afford to make another. Tomorrow she would go to Rebecca's office and hear what Paul Merritt had found. Whatever it was, she would deal with it. She had learned in the last 6 weeks that dealing with things was what she did now. It was what she had always done, actually. She had just been doing it alone, and now she was not. That made all the difference. Paul Merritt's office was on the 4th floor of a building in Hartford that smelled like printer toner and old carpet, and the specific combination of seriousness and underfunding that characterizes most professional spaces where important things happen quietly. He sat across from Sophia and Rebecca at a conference table, covered in printed spreadsheets, and spoke in the careful, factual way of someone who has learned to deliver large information in small portions. "I want to start with what I was initially looking for," he said, "and then tell you what I actually found." Rebecca nodded. Sophia had her hands folded on the table in front of her, very still. "I was looking for evidence of concealed assets in the standard places," Paul said. "Business accounts, investment vehicles, deferred compensation arrangements. What I found initially was an LLC registered in Clare Weston's name, opened 8 months before the date of your separation, into which Marcus had been routing a portion of his commission income." Sophia said nothing. "The initial figure visible in that account was approximately $94,000, Paul continued. "That number represents income diverted from the marital estate over a period of 8 months, beginning when you were approximately 4 months pregnant." The room was quiet. "He was building an exit fund," Rebecca said, for Sophia's benefit, "while you were buying nursery furniture." "Yes," Paul said. "But that is not the most significant finding." He turned to a second set of documents. "When I looked more closely at the full financial picture, including deferred commission structures that his employer uses, a practice common in pharmaceutical sales, and 2 additional investment accounts opened in the 14 months prior to the separation, the actual total of assets moved or structured outside of visible marital accounts is closer to $340,000. Sophia heard the number. She understood it. She did not move. $340,000. While she was pregnant, while she was recovering, while she was nursing Emma, at 3 in the morning, alone in a dark nursery, believing, with diminishing confidence but genuine effort, that her marriage was something worth trying to save. "But," Paul said, "that is still not the most significant finding." He turned to a third document and placed it on the table in front of Sophia. "This is a copy of the deed refinancing document you signed in March of last year. Specifically, I want to direct your attention to the notary stamp on page 4. Sophia looked at it. The notary whose stamp appears on this document is a man named Gerald Hooper, a licensed notary who operated in this county for 23 years. I checked his licensing records." He paused. In the way of a person who knows the next sentence is going to change the atmosphere of a room. Gerald Hooper retired in March of last year. His licensing lapsed at retirement. He entered a care facility the following week and has had no active notary status since. The refinancing document bearing his stamp is dated November of last year. Silence. "He couldn't have notarized it," Sophia said. "He was retired." "He was in a memory care facility by November," Paul said. "He has not held an active notary license since March." Rebecca said, very quietly, The refinancing document is fraudulent. That would be the legal characterization, Paul said. Sophia sat at the conference table in Paul Merritt's office and looked at the document in front of her and understood, with a clarity that had the specific quality of something you cannot unknow, that her husband had not simply made impulsive choices out of desire or selfishness. He had planned this. He had obtained a forged notarial stamp or used a retired notary's credentials without authorization and used them to remove her name from the deed of their home while she was 8 months pregnant. This was not a man who had lost his head. This was a man who had made a series of deliberate, calculated decisions and had gambled that she would not look closely enough to see them. She had trusted him. He had used that trust as a tool. "This isn't just divorce misconduct," Rebecca said, and her voice had a quality Sophia had not heard in it before, something iron and certain. Using a fraudulent, notarized document is a crime. Document fraud, potentially forgery. We are no longer only in family court territory. The second catastrophic event landed the following week. Garrett Price filed his response to Rebecca's documentation demands, and embedded in the financial disclosure forms, buried in the language about LLC formation and deferred compensation structures, was a clause that revealed something else. Marcus had, in the months before the separation, taken out a second mortgage on the house. Not a refinance, a separate loan against the property's equity. $112,000, drawn 11 months earlier, which had been deposited into an account Sophia had never known existed. The loan was secured against the marital property, which meant that even if the fraudulent refinancing was unwound and Sophia's name restored to the deed, there was now a lien against the house's equity that reduced its value for purposes of marital distribution. He had not only removed her name, he had borrowed against the foundation. Rebecca added this to the filing. She added it precisely and without visible emotion, the way you add a load-bearing fact to a structure that is already strong enough to hold it. The third catastrophic event was smaller and, in some ways, more painful. Sophia had an appointment at the pediatrician's office on a Wednesday afternoon, Emma's 8-week checkup. In the waiting room, she ran into Heather, a woman from their neighborhood who had been part of the social circle she and Marcus had shared for 3 years. Book club, block parties. The kind of neighbor you wave to from the driveway and occasionally have wine with on warm evenings. Heather looked at Sophia with the particular expression of someone who has heard a story and is not sure what to do with it. "I heard about everything," she said. "I'm so sorry it didn't work out." "Thank you," Sophia said. "Marcus mentioned that it had been really hard, that you'd been struggling since the birth, that he had to manage a lot." Sophia looked at Heather. She looked at Emma in her car seat, 8 weeks old, cheeks round and warm, entirely healthy, entirely cared for. "He was at a restaurant with his girlfriend at 11:47 p.m., Sophia said, steady and quiet. "On the night he sent me outside in February with our 10-day-old baby. I have the receipt. I have the post he deleted. I have the Ring camera footage from across the street. And I have the forensic accountant's report on the $340,000 he moved during my pregnancy." Heather opened her mouth, then closed it. "Have a good appointment, Heather," Sophia said. She walked into the pediatrician's office. She sat in the waiting room and breathed carefully, and did not let the grief of it show until she was in her car afterward, when she allowed herself exactly 4 minutes of crying before she wiped her face and drove back to Dana's house, because the community had partially turned. Because the story that had been running in the neighborhood and among their mutual friends was Marcus's story, shaped and distributed before Sophia had a chance to say a word. This is one of the most painful parts of what happens to people in Sophia's position, and it deserves to be said clearly. When someone controls the narrative early, the people who hear it first are the hardest to reach later. Some of them will never fully update, even when the truth becomes undeniable. The advice here is not to chase them. Do not spend energy trying to convince the people who chose a side without asking. Build new ground. Be consistent. Let the record speak when you cannot. Sophia did not chase them. She went home and helped Dana make dinner and held Emma against her chest while the evening news played quietly in the background and said to her daughter, very softly, that they were going to be all right. She believed it. For the first time, she genuinely believed it. 3 days after Paul Merritt's full report was delivered to Rebecca's office and formally filed as supplemental evidence, Marcus's attorney, Garrett Price, called Rebecca at 8 in the morning. Rebecca answered while eating breakfast. "Cole," she said. "Rebecca." Garrett's voice had changed. The expansive confidence of the courthouse hallway, the golden retriever energy, as Dana had once described it, was gone. What was left was the careful tone of a man who had reviewed documents overnight and was now operating in a different register entirely. "Garrett," Rebecca said, "I think we should discuss a path forward." "I'm listening." "My client is open to exploring a settlement structure." Rebecca set down her coffee. "Is he?" "But, given the complexity of the financial picture as it's developed," Garrett said, choosing his words with the caution of someone navigating a minefield in new shoes, "and given certain aspects of the property documentation that have come to light, Marcus would like to avoid extended proceedings." "Extended proceedings," Rebecca repeated, pleasantly. "You mean criminal referral?" A pause. "He would like to resolve this in family court." "Then he should have thought about that," Rebecca said, "before he used a fraudulent notary stamp on a deed modification while his wife was 8 months pregnant." Another pause, longer this time. What would Sophia need in order to consider a settlement? Rebecca picked her coffee back up. "I'll ask her." She drove to Dana's house that afternoon. Sophia was in the backyard, despite the cold, sitting on a folding chair with Emma bundled in her lap. "Just getting some air," she said. Dana came out with 3 mugs of tea and sat on the back steps. Rebecca laid it out plainly. Marcus wanted to settle. He was frightened of a criminal referral on the document fraud. He was frightened of what the $340,000 concealment looked like in front of a judge who had already seen his Valentine's Day post. He was frightened of what his employer's HR department would do with a public court record of financial misconduct. "What does settling mean?" Sophia asked. "It means we negotiate terms and present them to the court for ratification rather than going through a full trial. It means faster resolution. It means you control some of the terms rather than leaving them to a judge." "And what would I want?" "That," Rebecca said, "is exactly the right question." Sophia looked at Emma. The baby was awake, studying a leaf that had blown onto the blanket with the focused curiosity of someone encountering leaves for the first time, which she was. "I want the house," Sophia said. "My name restored to the deed and the fraudulent document formally invalidated on record. I want the second mortgage addressed in the settlement, not left for me to manage alone. I want primary custody with terms so clearly written that there is no room for him to reinterpret them later. I want full financial disclosure and a settlement figure that reflects what he actually hid, not the reduced number he structured it to look like. And I want all of it in court, on record, in Judge Warren's courtroom, where it cannot be quietly renegotiated later." Rebecca wrote it down. "Anything else?" she asked. "Yes," Sophia said. "I want it acknowledged, formally, in the record, that Emma was a 10-day-old infant when she was sent outside in February. I don't want that to disappear into a quiet settlement where nobody ever has to say it out loud." Dana made a small sound that was not quite words. Rebecca looked at Sophia over her legal pad with an expression that had warmth in it, genuine and unguarded. "All right," she said. "Let's go to work." What followed was 2 weeks of negotiation conducted entirely through attorneys, which is exactly how it should be conducted when the two parties are a woman trying to protect her daughter and a man trying to minimize his exposure to criminal prosecution. Garrett Price came to the table with a number. Rebecca told him the number was insufficient and explained why in 11 pages of documentation. Garrett came back with a revised number. Rebecca told him the property terms were still unacceptable. This continued with the rhythm of a process that has been going on in courtrooms for as long as there have been marriages that end badly, until the terms reached a point that Rebecca believed was defensible, and that Sophia, reading them at Dana's kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with Emma asleep in the next room, agreed reflected the truth of what had been taken from her. The night before the settlement hearing, Sophia could not sleep. She sat in the rocking chair in the guest room, in the dark, and thought about the house on Maple Ridge, the porch with the string lights, the nursery she had painted herself in a pale yellow that looked almost gold in the afternoon light, the kitchen where she had made dinner on Valentine's Day, still believing, still hoping. She thought about the version of herself that had stood on a stepladder in a winter coat, untangling Christmas lights, while Marcus stood below and told her she was going to fall. She thought about how she had told him she was not going to fall. She had been right about that, it turned out, just not in the way she had meant. The Honorable Patricia Warren had seen most things in 22 years of family court. She had seen extraordinary cruelty delivered in quiet voices and extraordinary love demonstrated in impossible circumstances. She had seen people at their worst and, occasionally, at something approaching their best. She had developed, over those decades, a quality of attention that was entirely without sentimentality and entirely without indifference, which is a difficult combination to maintain but a necessary one in her line of work. She reviewed the settlement documents for 6 minutes before the hearing began. Her expression did not change during those 6 minutes. The courtroom was very quiet. Sophia sat at the petitioner's table with Rebecca beside her. She was wearing a dark blue dress, and her hair was pulled back simply. She had not slept more than 4 hours, but she had put the sleeplessness away somewhere and replaced it with the particular, focused calm of someone who has come to the end of a very long road and intends to walk it to the finish. Marcus sat at the respondent's table with Garrett Price. He looked diminished. The suit was still expensive, but it hung on him differently than it had in the courthouse corridor 2 months earlier, when he had been confident that the gap between his resources and Sophia's would close this case in his favor. He had been wrong about a number of things. This had been the most consequential. Clare was not present. She had not been present at any of the hearings. After the conversation at the kitchen table when Marcus had confirmed the notary, she had moved her things out of the house with efficient speed and returned to her apartment and, as far as Sophia knew, largely removed herself from the situation. There was, in that, something that Sophia had not expected to feel, which was a small and complicated sympathy. Clare had made serious choices. She had also been told a version of events that was specifically constructed to make those choices seem less costly than they were. That was not, in the end, a very different experience from what Sophia had been through. The mechanisms were the same, only the positions were different. She did not share this observation with Dana, who had considerably less complicated feelings about Clare. Judge Warren set down the document. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "you understand that by entering into this settlement agreement, you are acknowledging the findings of the Forensic Financial Review as accurate and complete?" Marcus said, "Yes, Your Honor." "You understand that the property on Maple Ridge will revert to Mrs. Calloway's sole ownership, that the fraudulent notarization is formally invalidated on record, and that the second mortgage liability will be addressed through the settlement funds rather than through the marital property equity. Yes, Your Honor. You understand the child custody terms as written, including the provision that all communication regarding schedule modifications be documented through the co-parenting application specified in the agreement? Yes. Judge Warren looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I want to note, for the record, and I do this rarely in settlement hearings because my role is not to editorialize, but to adjudicate, that the circumstances documented in this case, specifically the actions taken on the night of February 14th, represent conduct that this court finds deeply troubling. A 10-day-old infant was removed from appropriate shelter in February temperatures by a parent who is recovering from major surgery. That fact is now part of this record and will remain so. The courtroom was very still. That said, the judge continued, the settlement as negotiated reflects the financial and custodial realities of the situation fairly, and it is in the interest of the child that this matter reach resolution. I am approving the agreement as submitted. She signed. The sound of the pen on paper was small in the large room. Rebecca touched Sophia's arm briefly, a small professional gesture that contained a great deal more than it showed. At the respondent's table, Garrett Price was gathering his papers quickly. Marcus sat for a moment longer, not moving, staring at the table. Then he pushed back his chair and stood, and Sophia watched him without expression as he walked toward the door without looking at her. He stopped just before reaching the exit. He turned. He looked at Sophia. His face had the open, unguarded quality of someone who has run out of positions to take. I made a mistake, he said. It was almost too quiet to hear. Sophia looked at him. The man she had married, the man who had stood on a porch in winter and handed her an extension cord and laughed when she told him she would not fall. The man who had sat beside her at a hospital table while she signed papers she trusted. The man who had opened a door on Valentine's Day and let in the February cold. I know, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not the absence of anger. It was the simple acknowledgement of a truth she had already made room for. He had made a mistake. Several. They were his to carry now, not hers. He left. Sophia sat for another moment in the quiet courtroom, Emma's carrier beside her on the chair, Emma asleep and warm and entirely unaware that the paperwork governing her future had just been settled. Then she stood, put on her coat, and walked out into the afternoon light. Dana was waiting on the courthouse steps. She had brought coffee. Rebecca came out a moment later, briefcase in hand, already checking her phone with the focused attention of someone who has the next case waiting. Rebecca, Sophia said. Rebecca looked up. Thank you. Rebecca looked at her for a moment. You did the work, she said. I just knew where to look. Then she walked to her car, and Sophia stood on the courthouse steps with her sister and her daughter and her coffee and the settlement agreement that was now officially part of the public record of Connecticut Family Court, and she felt, for the first time in 5 months, the specific and unrepeatable sensation of solid ground. There is a particular kind of reckoning that happens when a person who believed they were winning discovers that the game was never what they thought it was. Clare Weston had walked into the house on Maple Ridge in February with the confidence of someone who had assessed the situation and found it manageable. A tired new mother, a controlled man, a house that was already promised, a life that had been arranged for her arrival. What she had not assessed, because she had relied on Marcus's assessment, and Marcus had been wrong about almost everything, was Sophia Calloway. The weeks after the settlement were quiet ones for Clare, at least on the surface. She was back in her apartment, which she had, as she mentioned to Marcus in their last conversation, kept throughout. She was back at her job, which she had nearly lost during the suspension, but had managed to retain following a meeting with HR in which she submitted a written statement and agreed to a formal notation in her file. The colleagues who had whispered had mostly returned to their own concerns. The anonymous messages to her phone had slowed. She was fine, more or less. What she was not was unaffected. There is a specific experience that comes from watching the story you told yourself about a situation collapse under the weight of facts. Claire had told herself a story in which Marcus was a man in a failing marriage, making a clean break, ready to build something new. She had told herself that Sophia was finished, checked out, already gone in every way that mattered. Marcus had been consistent and convincing on this point. He was good at being convincing. What she had not known, until the legal proceedings became visible enough to find in public court records, was that the woman she had mentally filed under finished had been, during the months of Claire's certainty, documenting everything, securing representation, and building a case with the methodical patience of someone who had nothing left to lose and a daughter to protect. There was a Wednesday evening, about a month after the settlement, when Claire sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine and the quiet of her apartment around her, and thought for a long time about what she had contributed to and what she had walked away from, and what exactly the difference was between being deceived and choosing to believe the version of events that suited you. She did not arrive at comfortable answers. She did not expect to. What she did do, eventually, and this is a small detail that never made it into the courtroom or the legal record, but matters nonetheless, was write a letter. She did not send it to Sophia. She sent it to her own mother, a long, honest account of what she had done and what she had understood too late and what she was going to carry going forward. Her mother, who was a practical woman with a background in social work, read it and called her and said, "You cannot undo it, but you can make different choices, and that is what the rest of your life is for." Claire kept the letter. She read it occasionally in the way you read the things that are hardest to look at, because looking at them is part of not repeating them. Marcus, meanwhile, had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from Maple Ridge. It was adequate. It was not what he had planned. He had planned, in the detailed private vision he had carried for months, to live in the house on Maple Ridge with Claire and feel like a man who had chosen the life he wanted, rather than the one he had settled for. That version of events had closed. He showed up for his first supervised visitation with Emma on a Saturday morning in April, when the trees were beginning to come back and the world had the tentative brightness of early spring. The visitation center was a cheerful space with a dedicated family room and a staff member who documented the visit without judgment. He held Emma for the first time since the hospital. She had changed enormously in 4 months. She was heavier, more alert, interested in everything. She looked at him with the wide, frank curiosity of a baby who does not yet know what relationship means and treats every face with equal consideration. He cried, quietly, with his back half turned, but the supervising staff member noted it, and Sophia, reviewing the visit report that evening, saw the notation. She sat with that for a while. She did not feel triumph. She felt something more complicated, the particular sorrow of watching someone understand too late what they had, which is not the same as compassion, but lives in the same neighborhood. She called Rebecca. "He cried at the visit," she said. "That's not unusual," Rebecca said. "I know," Sophia said. I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it," Rebecca said. "He made choices. He's living in them. You made choices. You're living in yours. Those are separate things now." "Is it wrong that I still feel something?" "No, Rebecca said. "It would be wrong if you didn't. You were married to him for 4 years. You loved him. Feeling something is not the same as being weakened by it." After she hung up, Sophia sat for a while in the living room of the house on Maple Ridge. Her house. The string lights on the porch were on. She had put them back up on the first Saturday after she moved back in, standing on the stepladder in April instead of November, untangling the same strands she had untangled 4 years ago when everything still seemed possible. Dana had stood below and watched her. "You're going to fall," Dana had said. "I'm not going to fall," Sophia had replied. She had finished the lights. She had stood on the porch afterward and looked at them for a long time, burning steadily in the spring evening, and she had thought about how much the same they looked from where she was standing, how familiar, how entirely, completely different. 1 year later, the house on Maple Ridge had changed in the way that houses change when they are actually lived in, which is to say, it had become more itself. There were paintings on the walls, Sophia's own work, the kind of painting you make when you are working through something large and do not yet have words for it, color-heavy, slightly unresolved, in the beautiful way of things that are still becoming. Dana had framed the best one, an abstract piece in deep blue and warm gold, and hung it in the hallway without asking, which was an act of love Sophia thought about sometimes when she walked past it. Emma was 13 months old and had recently discovered stairs, which she approached with the confident recklessness of a person who has not yet had sufficient experience of falling. She pulled herself up on furniture and let go, and stood unsupported for stretches of 3 and 4 seconds before dropping to her hands and knees with an expression of mild surprise, then doing it again. She was, in Sophia's entirely unbiased assessment, extraordinary. The nonprofit had been Rebecca's idea, or rather, she had been the one to name what Sophia was already doing. In the months following the settlement, Sophia had found herself talking to 2 different women who had reached out through mutual connections, both in early stages of contested divorces, both frightened, both convinced they had no good options. She had spent hours with each of them. She had connected one to Rebecca and one to a legal aid organization in New Haven, and both of them had told her, independently and in different language, that the most useful thing she had done was tell her own story directly, and without the false comfort of pretending it had been easy. The nonprofit was called The First Call. It operated out of a small rented office space and a website and a partnership with 3 family law attorneys who provided reduced-rate consultations. It had served 41 women in its first 8 months. It had a waiting list. Rebecca served on the board. Dana managed the communications. Paul Merritt had donated his services to 2 cases that required forensic accounting work. On a Thursday evening in March, exactly 13 months after Valentine's Day, Sophia was in the kitchen making dinner when her phone rang. It was a number she did not recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then she answered. The voice on the other end was young and frightened and trying very hard not to sound either of those things. A woman named Annalise, 29 years old, 3 weeks postpartum, calling from her car in a parking lot because she had not wanted to make the call inside the house. Her husband had been acting strangely since the birth. His phone was always face down. He had come home 2 nights ago and told her she needed to give him space. She had signed some financial paperwork he had put in front of her 6 months ago, and she was not entirely sure what it said. Sophia stood at the kitchen counter and listened. Emma was in the other room, audible in the particular way of a toddler who is up to something but has not yet reached the stage that requires intervention. The string lights were on outside the window. The paintings were on the walls. The kitchen smelled like garlic and olive oil and the specific warmth of a house that is being used and loved. Okay, Sophia said. Here's what I need you to do. Are you somewhere you can write this down? Yes, Annalise said. First thing, photograph every financial document you can access on your phone tonight. Statements, tax forms, anything. Do it before he realizes you're looking. Okay? Second thing, tomorrow morning, you're going to make a call. I'm going to give you a number. Okay? The call is going to feel scary. Make it anyway. The first call is the one that changes everything. I know that because I made mine from my sister's kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, 13 months ago, and everything that followed from that call was hard and worth it. A pause, then quietly. What happened to you? Sophia looked out the kitchen window at the porch lights. My husband sent me outside in February, she said. 3 weeks postpartum, with our 10-day-old daughter. And I didn't collapse, and I didn't run. I found the right people, and I documented everything, and I fought back through every legal channel available to me, and I am standing in my kitchen right now in the house that is in my name, cooking dinner with my daughter in the next room laughing at something. Another pause. It got better, Annalise said. Not quite a question. It got better, Sophia confirmed. Not easily, not quickly, but completely. She heard Annalise exhale. Write down this number, Sophia said. She gave her Rebecca's office line. She stayed on the phone for another 12 minutes, listening and answering. The way someone does when they know the exact weight of what is being carried on the other end of the line because they have carried it themselves. When she hung up, she stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went to check on Emma, who had gotten into the Tupperware cabinet and was conducting a serious experiment involving a lid and a colander, and the question of whether the lid would fit, which it would not. But Emma was not ready to accept this conclusion yet. Sophia sat on the kitchen floor beside her daughter and watched her try. Emma picked up the lid. She studied the colander. She tried again, with a concentration that was entirely unselfconscious and entirely magnificent. This, Sophia thought, this is what you protect. Not a house, not a settlement figure, not a court record. This person, this small, fierce, completely determined person who tries again every time without apology. She reached out and let Emma press the lid into her hand, the way babies do when they want a witness. She took it. She turned it over, the way you do when you are playing along seriously. I see it, she said. Good work. Emma looked at her with complete satisfaction. Then she took the lid back and tried again. Outside, the evening light was doing what March light does in Connecticut when the season is beginning to turn, coming in low and warm and gold through the kitchen window, falling across the floor in long rectangles, catching the edge of Emma's hair and the corner of the refrigerator and the small row of photos on the windowsill, including one of Sophia and Dana and Emma taken last October, all three of them squinting into the sun in the backyard with the kind of joy that does not need to perform itself. Sophia looked at the photo. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the kitchen she had come back to, the house she had refused to be taken from, the life she had rebuilt, one documented fact, and one phone call, and one day at a time. She had not wanted this story. She had not chosen the night that started it. She had not asked to stand in the February cold with a 10-day-old baby and nothing but her own clarity and her sister's phone number and the choice between collapsing and continuing. But she had made the choice, and she had continued. And the woman who was sitting on a kitchen floor in March, watching her daughter try the same impossible thing 17 times without giving up, was not the woman who had stood on a stepladder, stringing Christmas lights, and believed that a good life was something your husband helped you build. She was something better than that. something harder and more specific and more entirely her own. The lights on the porch came on automatically at dusk. They were the same lights, the same strands she had untangled 4 years ago, and again, 1 year ago, from her position at the top of a stepladder, with her sister below her saying she was going to fall. She had not fallen. She was not going to fall. Here's the last thing worth knowing about Sophia Calloway. The thing that matters most and is easiest to miss in a story full of courtrooms and documents and the specific machinery of legal consequence. None of it. Not the forensic accounting, not the ring camera, not the fraudulent notary that Paul Merritt found in a licensing record. None of it would have been possible if she had not, on the worst night of her life, in the February cold with a 10-day-old baby strapped to her chest and a door closed behind her, made a choice. Not the phone call. The choice came before the phone call. The choice was this. She decided that what had been done to her did not define what she would do next. That is the whole story. Everything else, the lawyers and the hearings and the settlement and the non-profit and the paintings on the walls and Emma on the kitchen floor trying the same impossible thing again and again without apology, all of it follows from that one quiet decision made in the cold outside a house she had helped build by a woman who refused, even then, even there, to stop believing she was worth fighting for. She was right about that. She had always been right about that. Emma finally got the lid to sit flat on top of the colander. It did not fit exactly, but it sat there, balanced, wobbling slightly, held in place by persistence rather than design. Emma looked at it with an expression of pure and complete triumph. Then she looked at her mother. Sophia laughed, genuine, unguarded, full. "I know," she said. "I know. You did it." Outside on Maple Ridge, the porch lights burned steady and warm against the coming dark. Inside, a mother and her daughter sat on the kitchen floor together, and everything, for now, was exactly right. Closing statement. The content you just experienced was researched, constructed, and manually edited by our team, crafted with intention to bring you not just a story, but a perspective, a lesson, and a reminder that even in the hardest moments, the right choice is still available to you. Thank you for giving us your time. It is not something we take lightly.